Hello, Pathfinders. The foundation for our whole study of apologetics is the Bible, right? This is the source that we draw upon to make that defense for our faith. So we're spending some time looking at the Bible itself. And remember, last week we answered that very important question: can we really trust the Bible to be the foundation of our faith? And we established the fact that, yes, we can trust the Bible because we have evidence that supports the authenticity and the veracity, the truthfulness, the accuracy, the historicity of the Bible. And we looked at those three very important tests of historiography. You remember what that is? The study of any ancient document, you put it to the test. And there are three primary tests that are used. There's that internal evidence test. Is it consistent? Is it coherent? Is the document free of contradictions and errors? The internal evidence test, and applying that to the Bible passes that test with flying colors. And then there was what's called the bibliographical test. And remember what that was? How many ancient copies of that document do we have? And how close are those copies? When were they written compared to when the actual documents themselves were written? And again, on the basis of the bibliographical evidence, the Bible far exceeds any ancient history, any ancient writing. The Bible definitely passes that bibliographical test. And then we looked at the external evidence test. Are there some external sources that confirm that document or confirm the things that that document reports? And we saw that the Bible absolutely passes that test. We have those historical records from a Roman historian, a Jewish historian. We have external verification of Jesus and his crucifixion and Pontius Pilate and so many of the other details that we find in the New Testament. So we have that external evidence that supports the Bible and the New Testament. And we talked about archaeology as confirmed so many of the places and locations that are mentioned in the New Testament. That's an external source for verifying the Bible. So we can establish the fact that, yes, we can trust the Bible. And today I want to do something, I want to follow up on this, and we're going to look at this question. What about the New Testament itself? You know, most of our Christianity is based on the New Testament, the story of Jesus and the Gospels and the letters that these apostles wrote. So I want to spend a couple of weeks looking at the New Testament. And I thought it might be helpful for us to just get an overview of the New Testament. If this is the primary source for our Christian apologetic, I think it's important for us as Christians to have a good understanding of exactly what we're talking about. What about this New Testament? And we're going to look at a good overview of the New Testament this week. And then next week, I want to follow up with who decided this New Testament? How did we come up with the 27 books that make up our New Testament? Why only those books? Who said these are going to be the authoritative scriptures of the New Testament? So let's get a quick overview. This is New Testament 101. This is basic information about this book upon which we build our defense, our apologetic. This is basic information that all of us need to know. So if we look at the New Testament, how many books? Well, I've already alluded to that. We know that there are 27 books in our New Testament. Hopefully you already knew that. I think you also know that the language of the New Testament would have been the Greek language. That was the predominant language all across the Mediterranean world, all across that Roman Empire. Greek had become the established language. So the writers of the New Testament wrote in the language of the people. They wrote in the Greek language. And if you look at the time span here, how many years is covered by the New Testament writings? Roughly, it's a half a century, from about 45 AD. That's when some of these first documents started to appear, up until 95 AD. And that would have been the book of Revelation, the very last book in the New Testament. So you've already learned something there about the New Testament. You compare that to the Old Testament. The Old Testament covers a lot longer period, about 4,000 years compared to the, 50 years of the New Testament, the writings. Let's talk about the New Testament. What in the world does testament mean? Well, in our modern English vocabulary, we use the word testament. It can apply to a will. Somebody puts together a last will and testament. You better have some kind of a will and testament. And what's a will? What's a last will and testament? These are your instructions. These are legal binding instructions of what you want done with your estate. So it's a legal document. It has to be truthful, has to be accurate, has to be notarized. That's the last will and testament. But applying this to the Bible, the idea of testament means covenant. Literally, that's what the word means, going back into the biblical times. It was a covenant. In the ancient world, this is interesting. You would oftentimes make an agreement with somebody, maybe a legal agreement between two parties, and they would call it cut a covenant. This would become the legal binding covenant or agreement between those two parties. And they would actually, you can read about this in the Bible, they would take an animal. So two parties say, yes, we're going to agree to this. Here's our agreement. Here's our covenant. And they would literally cut the covenant. They would take an animal and they would, kind of gory here, but they would cut that animal in half. And then the two parties would walk through that cut animal. A symbol there of the seriousness of the agreement that they were making. They were cutting a covenant. So in biblical times, almost like in our current times, a covenant was a legal binding agreement between two parties. So we have two covenants, don't we, in the Bible? We have the Old Covenant. We call that what? The Old Testament. Means the same thing, testament, covenant. We have the Old Covenant, and that was originally cut there with Moses at Mount Sinai. And you remember the tablets where God gave the 10 Commandments. So here was that original, that Old Covenant, the Old Testament. So there's Brother Moses there receiving the 10 Commandments, the covenant, the agreement that God was making with his new chosen people there on a mountaintop, Mount Sinai. So hang on to that. We come to the New Testament. Think about this, not through Moses. Now the new covenant is cut with Jesus. And, we talked about blood being shed and the parties walking between the cut animal, the blood that was shed. What a perfect representation there of Jesus. He literally cut a covenant with us, didn't he? His crucifixion on the cross. The new covenant, the prophet Jeremiah prophesied about this. God said, I'm going to make a new covenant with you, a new testament with you. It's not going to be written on clay tablets anymore. The new covenant will be written on our hearts. And think about this old covenant there at Mount Sinai, the new covenant, God cut with us. Jesus cut for us where? On another mountain, we might say, Mount Calvary. And that was the crucifixion. Kathy and I went to Israel a couple of years ago. I know some of you maybe been to Israel, and there's actually this location there on the left, just outside Jerusalem. This is Calvary or Golgotha. This is the place of the skull. And if you can see my cursor here, there in the side of this cliff, you see this thing that looks like a face. It looks like a skull. And most scholars today believe, we talk about historical, archaeological evidence, most scholars believe that it was on top of this place this place of the skull, Golgotha, where Jesus cut that new covenant with us. So now we know what testament means. What are we talking about? We're talking here about a new agreement, a new covenant, a new way God is now going to deal with us as his people. All right, if we look at the New Testament itself, what about the authors of the New Testament? Interesting to look at this. All the letters, books of the New Testament were either written by apostles, and I've got Matthew, John, and Peter there. Obviously, these were among the first 12 apostles, the 12 disciples of Jesus. So we have Matthew's gospel, and we have John's gospel, and we have some of John's letters. We have two of Peter's letters in our New Testament. So every document in the New Testament was either written by an apostle, and I'm including Paul there. I think we all know Paul wasn't one of the 12 disciples. He wasn't one of the 12 original apostles. But after Paul had his dramatic Damascus Road experience and he came to believe in Jesus, and now he is, instead of being a persecutor of the church, he's now one of this group of Christians. And he goes to Jerusalem and he meets with the apostles, and they give their stamp of approval on Paul. And he says, God has called me to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And that's why Paul wanted to go on his missionary journeys and taking the gospel, not just to Jews. Matthew, John, and Peter, they were doing a great job of that in and around Jerusalem. They were presenting the gospel to Jews. Paul said, I'm going to take this gospel to everyone. I'm going to take it to Gentiles as well. So that's why Paul's considered to be one of the apostles. And that's why his letters are included in our New Testament. So all the New Testament documents, either written by an apostle or somebody closely associated with the apostles. So that's going to cover the rest of the writers of the New Testament. We have Mark, the Gospel of Mark. He's actually known as John Mark in the New Testament. So Mark wasn't there for any of the story of Jesus. He wasn't one of the original 12, but Mark's gospel that he would later write was considered to be authoritative and inspired because of his association with one of the apostles, with Paul. He was with Paul there on his first missionary journey. So he was an associate of Paul. He was also a close associate of Peter as well. And then we have Luke. Luke wasn't one of the 12 disciples, was he? No. Luke was a Gentile. In fact, I pointed out here, Luke is the only non-Jewish writer of any of the Bible. The rest of the Bible, all the other books in the whole Bible, all written by Jews. Luke is the only Gentile writer of the scriptures. But God inspired Luke to write his gospel. And where did Luke get his information? He wasn't there for the life of Jesus during those years, but he was a traveling companion with Paul. He was with Paul on his missionary journeys. So Luke, being associated with the apostle Paul, that's why his book is included in the New Testament. And then we have these two guys, James and Jude. We're all familiar with the New Testament book of James. Now, this wasn't James. There were a couple of disciples of Jesus by the name of James. A lot of people get this confused. But this James, who wrote the New Testament book, he was the half brother of Jesus. So that gives pretty good credibility to what he wrote. And then James was also a leader there, one of the early leaders in that first church in Jerusalem. So he obviously had a close connection there with the apostles in Jerusalem. And the same for Jude, the little book of Jude in our New Testament. Jude wasn't one of the original 12 disciples. He wasn't an apostle, but he too was another one of these brothers, actually half brother of Jesus. And he was another leader of the early church. So he had a close association with the apostles. So what do we see there in the New Testament? We have a total of 8 writers of the New Testament, either apostles or close associate of the apostles. And we're going to see next week, this was one of the litmus tests that the early church gave as they started to formulate the 27 books that make up our canon, our authoritative, inspired list of books. One of their big litmus tests was the document, the book, the gospel, the letter had to be written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle. If you look at the order of the books, this is kind of interesting. How are the books organized in our New Testament? And why are they organized this way? Well, here's the reason why. They're not given to us in chronological order. That might have been interesting, might have been helpful to see chronologically, this book was written first, this book was written second, third, fourth, fifth. But that's not the way the church eventually organized the list of 27 books that we have in our Bibles today. They're not organized chronologically, but they are organized very logically. There's a very logical way these books are grouped together. The first grouping, that would be the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gospel means good news. So these are the four inspired writers telling us about the good news of Jesus. The first three of these are grouped together because they're called the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, synoptic comes from two good Greek words. The syn means together, the optic, we know what that means, to see. So these three are considered synoptic gospels because all three of these basically see together on the overall presentation of the life of Jesus. John, the fourth gospel, is very different in its structure. It's the last gospel that was written. And so the way it's structurally put together, it's different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it's not one of these synoptic gospels. So you've learned a big word there, synoptic gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right, so the gospels, a good starting point. Let's start with the story of Jesus. So these four writers give us that good news, that story of Jesus. The next book, written by Luke as well, is the book of Acts, right, in our listing. Now we get into the historical books. Actually, the first four gospels are historical books as well, as we've already established, the historical evidence there for the gospels. But the book of Acts is placed next because it's going to tell us now the ongoing story after the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. Now we're going to read about, very logically, what happened next. And we see Pentecost, the birth of the church. We see the spread of the gospel across that Mediterranean world with Paul and his missionary journeys. So very logically placed right after the four gospels. All right, after the book of Acts, what do we get into? We get into all these epistles or letters. These deal with the doctrinal development of the church and dealing with practical problems there in the life of the early church. We might say these epistles, these people who wrote these letters, they're now interpreting the life of Jesus. They're showing doctrinal implications of who Jesus was. That's the focus of these books. They deal with some maybe disputes that are happening in the churches. So we have the Gospels, we have the book of Acts, and we have the epistles. Let's break down the epistles a little bit here. What do we see? The first listing there of epistles are all of Paul's letters, 13 of them. And look at how they're logically organized. This is kind of interesting. They start with what? Romans, the book of Romans, and going through the next 13 books in the New Testament, all written by Paul. And notice that they are ordered logically by length in descending length. So there's a good way logically the church wanted to put Paul's letters together. Actually, I think the only real exclusion to that is Galatians and Ephesians. I think Ephesians technically is a little bit shorter than Galatians in the Greek language, but basically they're organized by descending length. And then notice of these 13 letters, look at how they're grouped together. The first group are all letters to churches. There are 9 of these. So Paul writes, he wrote these letters to the churches. Now they are grouped together by these 9 letters to churches, again in descending order of length. The second subgroup, letters to individuals. And we have Titus and Timothy, First and Second Timothy and Titus. So an interesting logical grouping there of Paul's letters. And here's how most scholars and New Testament folks will group Paul's letters together. If we look here at some basic categories, his very first letters would have been Galatians, First and Second Thessalonians. So they're called the early letters. His major letters, these are his major doctrinal letters. That's the book of Romans, First and Second Corinthians. And then in Paul's first time in prison there in Rome, we've talked about this. He wrote some letters. This would be Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philippians. They're called the prison letters. And then finally, Timothy, First and Second Timothy, Titus, these letters to individuals. These are known as his pastoral letters. He's writing to these 2 young pastors, these 2 young church leaders, Timothy and Titus, and giving them instructions about the church and how to run the church and the leadership structure of the church. So there are Paul's letters. They come next in our listing in the New Testament. So after Paul's letters, his 13 letters, now we get what's called the general epistles. And sometimes they're called the Catholic epistles, but we're not talking here about Roman Catholic Church. Catholic is the Latin word for universal. So these are letters not written to a specific church, but they were written for a more general, a universal audience. You know, Paul's letters were written to churches or individuals. These are general letters written to be distributed all across the churches in the Roman Empire. And look at the listing of these. The book of Hebrews. That's, we don't know who the author of the book of Hebrews was. Early on, it was believed Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Some people group the book of Hebrews in with Paul's letters, so they say he had 14 letters, but modern scholarship says we just simply don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. But the fact that it has so much good doctrine in there, and the focus is certainly on Jesus and the supremacy of Christ, that's why it was included in authoritative, inspired documents to be in our New Testament. And then we have the book of James, and I note here that this was probably the very first book written in the New Testament, maybe as early as 45 AD. And then we have Peter, he has 2 letters. We have John, he has 3 letters. Again, there's no specific audience addressed in these letters as they begin. So they had a more universal target audience. And then we have Jude there, that half brother of Jesus, an early leader in the church, along with James. So we have Paul's letters, 13. Then we have these general Catholic or universal letters, or 8 of these in our New Testament listing. And then the final book, it's kind of a category all by itself, and that's the book of Revelation. And this is known as the Apocalypse. That's actually the very first word in Greek in the book of Revelation. It's the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. That word means the uncovering, the unveiling, the revealing. So book of Revelation is going to uncover, unveil, reveal the place of Jesus, both in the past and the present and the future. Jesus tells John, I want you to write down what was and is to come. And that's the book of Revelation. And that's a tough one to read and understand. It's an example of this apocalyptic literature, very popular in biblical times. The book of Daniel is apocalyptic in nature with these visions. apocalyptic images. There's some parts of the book of Ezekiel that are apocalyptic in nature. But book of Revelation appropriately, logically placed at the end of our listing of New Testament documents because it was the last New Testament book written, probably around 90 to 95 AD when the Apostle John was exiled there on the island of Patmos when he received his revelation. So there you go. There's a good overview of our New Testament, and that's why we affirm as Christians today. Again, here's the foundation of our whole apologetic. It's largely based on this New Testament, this new covenant. And we believe these are the only inspired, authoritative books of this New Testament, this new covenant between God and us. And again, next week, we're going to look at a very interesting study. Why? You know, we can't just say we accept these 27 books, no, but no other books, no other documents. We have to have a reason why. Why did the church eventually decide these books alone? And we'll look at this question of the canon. How did the canon of the New Testament start to be formulated? Give you a little preview there. There were a lot of documents circulated among the early churches. It wasn't just these 27 books. Certainly, the early churches were reading these and studying these as they gathered together. But how about this? There was also a Gospel of Peter, allegedly written by Peter, that was floating around. A Gospel of Mary. This would have been Mary Magdalene, allegedly wrote this story of Jesus. A Gospel of Philip, one of the disciples. The Gospel of Thomas, another disciple. The Gospel of Judas. The epistle, the letter of Barnabas. Barnabas was a traveling companion of Paul. So the early church had to sooner or later say, wait a minute, we've got all kinds of written things circulating among the churches. We need to settle. What are the books that we're going to say are the only inspired authoritative books? And we'll see next week why the church decided on the 27 that are in our New Testament and why they eliminated some of these other documents. So that's the New Testament. Again, next week we'll look at the formation of the New Testament canon. How did the church arrive at accepting only these 27 books? And that's where we're headed. I hope you enjoyed that little overview there of the New Testament. I think that's pretty basic information that all of us need to know about. And again, we're just adding more and more foundation to our apologetic, to our defense. If we make a big deal about the Bible, we got to know what the Bible is, why the books that are in the Bible are in there, and that's going to help us be able to have that defense, to be able to give that reason for the hope that we have. God bless you, Pathfinders. I'm going to stop sharing my screen to say goodbye to you for this week, and I will see you back again next week, and we'll continue at our look at the Bible. Bless you guys. Stay safe this week.